Next, we have to look at the knee screws home to fully extend due to the shape of the medial femoral condyle. In other words, when we get the full extension, it's going to screw in. As the knee approaches full extension, the tibia must externally rotate. Now it's going to rotate to the outside approximately 10 degrees to achieve proper alignment of the tibial and femoral condyles. Right there. Tibial and femoral condyles have to be lined up. So it's going to externally rotate. That's in full extension. We have close congruency of the articulating surfaces of the femur and tibia. There's no appreciable rotation of the knee. So if you look at it when it's in full, when your knee is in full extension, it's pretty locked in. It's not going to rotate. It's not going to flex side to side. It's not going to do much of anything. It's locked in because it's rotated and locked itself in. Now, during initial flexion from full extension, the knee unlocks by the tibia rotating internally. When you extend it, the tibia will rotate externally. When you start to flex the knee, it rotates internally to a degree from its externally rotated position to achieve flexion. So in other words, when it's locked in, it's externally, the tibia is externally rotated. When you flex, it's got to unlock, so it's going to internally rotate so flexion can't occur at the knee joint. Now the movements. If we look at flexion, let me put my model down. If we look at flexion, what is flexion? Bending or decreasing the angle between the femur and the leg, characterize the heel moving toward the buttocks. In extension, straightening or increasing the angle between the femur and the lower leg. Now, this is what we were talking about before. Once you flex the knee, when you start from full extension, once you flex the knee to about 30 degrees of flexion, you can externally rotate. That's a rotary movement of the leg laterally away from midline. In other words, the foot's going to turn out, and this could be a rotation about 45 degrees. For internal rotation, it's a rotary movement of the lower leg. The foot is going to internally rotate toward the midline. That's about 30 degrees. Neither will occur unless the knee is flexed about 20 to 30 degrees or greater. Once again, this is just reviewing what we've already talked about. Now, let's look at movements, physiological movements versus accessory motions. Now, let's look at. Now, if we look at the tibia and fibula, or tibia and femur, as a person stands up from a squatted position, the femur must roll forward and simultaneously slide backward on the tibia. So if we're here, if we're in that full flex position and when we're sitting down, when we stand up, it's not going to just do that. It has to roll, glide, and slide on that tibial plateau in order for it to fit into that and roll, glide, and slide on that tibial plateau. If not for the slide, the femur would roll off the front. So if we're in this completely flexed position, if we're trying to come up and it didn't roll on there, roll and slide, it would roll off the front, and it's not going to do that. Once again, if we look at the posterior versus the ACL versus the PCL, it's going to be involved in there along with the other connective tissue, because once again, when we squat from here and we squat down, it's going to roll, glide, and slide in there, because if not, if it didn't roll and slide, it would fall off backwards. But it's going to roll forward and slide and glide in there to that position, and when we come up, it's going to roll, slide, and glide again, just like that. Now, spin may occur in isolation or in combination with roll and glide. So even if it's rolling and gliding, there's going to be a little bit of rotation in there. As the knee flexes or extends, spin occurs to some degree. So if we look at that in example 1, the femur spins medially or internally rotate as the knee reaches full extension. So if we're coming up here, right, the knee will internally rotate as the knee reaches full extension. So it'll internally rotate a little bit. All right? Because what it's doing, remember, as we get to full extension, the tibia is going to externally rotate. So that means the femur is going to internally rotate. All right? Make sense? Now, this is from module 1. We get roll, slide. Let's do it again. As it comes up that way, rolls, slides, and glides. And then it'll also spin. It locks it into place. You can see it rolls this way. The lower leg will externally rotate, with the upper leg going to internally rotate to lock it into place. But as soon as you do flexion, it's going to do just the opposite. It's going to unlock. It rolls, glides, and spins. Come up. There it goes again. Spins. Very good. Now let's look at the muscles. Let's look at the quadricep muscles. I'll hang on to this. It extends the knee, located in an anterior compartment of the thigh, consists of 4 muscles. We have the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis to the outside, the vastus intermedius, that's the one deepest in there of the quad muscles. We have the vastus medialis. Remember too, the rectus femoris is the only one of the quad muscles that crosses both the hip and the knee joint. The vastus lateralis, intermedius, and medialis only perform knee extension. That's all they do. The rectus femoris does knee extension, but it also does hip flexion as well. Now, let's look at the Q angle. This seems to confuse a lot of people. It's a central line of pull from the entire quadricep as it runs from the anterior superior iliac spine to the center of the patella. The line of pull of the patella tendon runs from the central part of the patella to the center of the tibial tuberosity. In other words, if we start up here, we draw a line down. Basically, it's a vector. Draw it straight down through this. The angle formed by the intersection of these 2 lines at the patella is the Q angle. So we get the central line of pull of the muscle. The entire quad runs from the AS, IS, all the way through where it attaches at. The line of pull of the patella tendon runs from the central part of the patella to the center of the tibial tuberosity. So this is going to be a slight angle between these 2. That is going to be what we consider the Q angle. Now, normally the angle will be 15 degrees or less for males and 20 degrees or less for females. Now, this is generally due because of the size and shape of the hips. If you look at males, they have a taller pelvis and it's narrower. Females have a shorter pelvis and it's wider. This is basically for childbearing. So that's why there's a difference in Q angle. But I also want you to notice as well too, that one of the things that could affect the Q angles is the angle of the head of the femur and the neck here. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. We all have the same parts, but a lot of times in different people, this angle will vary. Some people will have a smaller angle, some people will have a larger angle, and based on whether you're male or female, this could change drastically, which could also affect the Q angle. Now, the dynamic Q angles are very significantly vary during planting and cutting activities. The higher Q angles generally predispose people in varying degrees to a variety of potential knee problems. Think about that. You got a big Q angle and you try to cut and you're trying to come in and do that, it's going to increase the stress on the knee. Now, problems include lateral patellar subluxation. Lateral meaning to the outside, subluxation means a dislocation. Patellar compression segment is going to push, the muscles are going to pull the patella in and compress it, which can cause chondromalacia, which is the wearing of the cartilage on the posterior side of the patella or the kneecap, and it could cause some ligament injuries as well. For people with above normal Q angles, it's particularly important to maintain high levels of strength and endurance in the vastus medialis. Because if not, you're always going to, that vastus lateralis is stronger. It's going to pull to the outside, and it's going to cause the kneecap to track wrong. So once again, vastus lateralis so as to counteract the lateral pull of the vastus lateralis. So you've got to have, once again, balance not only on front to back sides of all the joints, but the muscles on medial versus lateral sides as well too. Also superior and inferior. So if you don't have all these particular muscle imbalances, it could cause that kneecap to track wrong, and you're going to have some real problems and put more stress on the ligaments, because the bigger the Q angle, muscle weaknesses, it's going to pull on the patella. It's going to cause more stress on the ligaments as you're standing there trying to do some movement. So once again, you have to look, you have to analyze what the person looks like, what their Q angle is like, what's the strength of each muscle group. And strength, remember, is different categories. Could be flexibility strength, could be absolute, could be speed strength and all that. Because if it causes the joint to have any amount of stress and it doesn't move efficiently, optimize the efficiency to maximize the effectiveness of those movement patterns. If you don't find out where there's a deficit, there's going to be some problems there. And the Q angle could be a problem too. So if you've got an excessive Q angle, you've got to do the proper types of strength training to find out where the deficits are all around that joint to make sure everything stays in place when you're doing a particular movement. The hamstring group, it's responsible for knee flexion, bending the knee. It's located in the posterior compartment of the thigh on the back side. Consists of 3 muscles. Semitendinosus, it's a medial internal rotator as well. The semimembranosus, it's medial internal rotator. And the biceps femoris, it's a lateral external rotator as well. The popliteus, remember it's attached on the outside there and crosses over. That also is a secondary flexor of the knee. Also does internal rotation. Now, these are 2 joint muscles. Most effective with either the origin or insertion is stabilized to prevent movement in the direction of the contracting muscle. Let's go through that. To a degree, muscles are able to exert greater force when lengthened than when they are shortened. We looked at eccentric versus concentric. You're stronger when the muscle is being lengthened because it's decelerating something. You're approximately 20 to 40% stronger in an eccentric action than you are concentric. The hamstring muscles in the erector piriformis are biarticular. They cross 2 joints. Now the gracilis, sartorius, and semimembranosus join together distally to form the pes arcerinus. Hard to pronounce, isn't it? Attaches to the anterior medial aspect of the proximal tibia, just below the level of the tibial tuberosity, right in here. So if we look at the tibial tuberosity, let's look at the medial aspect. Anterior medial aspect of the proximal tibia, just below the level of the tibial tuberosity. Here's the tibial tuberosity, so it's right in here. Their attachment and posterior medial line of pull enable them to assist in knee flexion, particularly once the knee is flexed and the hip is externally rotated. So you come up here externally rotated and flex the knee. The medial and lateral gastroc heads attach posteriorly on the medial and lateral femoral condyles. Now remember too, the hamstring just doesn't cause flexion of the knee. The gastrocnemius does cross the knee joint as well. And not only does plantar flexion, but it also assists in knee flexion as well. Now the sartorius It increases its total length and becomes a better flexor at the knee when the pelvis is rotated posteriorly and stabilized by the abdominal muscle. So if you've got really bad anterior tilt and you put it neutral, that's still, you're posteriorly tilting it into a neutral position, but when it lengthens, it becomes it helps with flexion of the knee. This is exemplified by trying to flex the knee and cross the legs in a sitting position. What they used to call the Taylor's muscle. Usually, one usually leans backward to flex the legs at the knees. Lean back. You lean backwards to do that. Football kickers invariably lean well backwards to raise and fix the rectus femoris origin to make it a more effective knee extensor. Now, knee joint muscle locations. Anterior, on the anterior side, we primarily have knee extensors. That's the rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, and vastus lateralis. Those are the quad muscles. So you can see the rectus femoris crosses the hip joint. All the other ones are on the thigh itself. Here's the patellar tendon, and here's the patellar ligament, depending on what book you read again. Some call it patellar tendon, others call it patellar ligament. Since it crosses it holds bone to bone, they consider it a ligament. But here it attaches to the tibial tuberosity. Now the knee joint muscle locations. Posterior is primarily knee flexion, biceps femoris, semimembranosus, semitendinosus. We also have the sartorius, the gracilis, and the popliteus. So if we look here, the ischial tuberosity is where the hamstrings attach at. That's where they originate at. Biceps femoris attaches to the outside. The tendinosus and the membranosus will attach on the medial side. The gastric is also another mover for knee flexion. Now the nerves, femoral nerves innervates the knee extensors. That's the rectus femoris, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius, vastus lateralis. The sciatica nerve, it's in the tibial division. That does the semitendinosus, membranosus, and biceps femoris. That's the long head of the bicep fem. Remember, bicep. It has the bicep femoris has two heads. You got a long and a short head. Common peroneal, the fibular divisions. That's the bicep femoris. That's the short head. You have two different innervations for that one muscle. Now the quadricep muscles, they're vital in jumping, but also too, so are the hamstrings if you really look at it. They function as a decelerating, as they come back when you're coming down this way. If you look at it, the hamstrings are extending, the quadriceps are lengthening just a little bit too, along with the hamstrings. Now, also too, the quadriceps are very, very important when you're decelerating or decreasing speed to change direction. So as you're running along and you start to decelerate, the leg comes out in front of you a little bit more. That's like a braking action. But what happens when you move forward? The quadriceps is lengthening to decelerate that. So once you stop, you can change direction. Also, when you're coming down from a jump, when you jump up and you land, what's happening? Your toes hit, then your heels, and then you bend the knees. So the hamstring and the quad are actually lengthening to decelerate that. Take the stress off the knee. You don't want to go too far forward. You want to be just in the right position to decelerate that to make sure those forces are distributed evenly. Eccentric action. Forget that word. Cross it out, put action. Eccentric action during decelerating actions. Control slowing of movements initiated by previous phases of whatever skill you're doing. Now the rectus femoris, the two joint muscles, vastus medialis, intermedius, and vastus lateralis, which is the largest, they attach to the patella, then the tibial tuberosity via the patellar tendon or the patellar ligament, depending on what book you read. I told you. all superficial, palatable. In other words, you can feel them, except the vastus intermedius because it's underneath the rectus femoris. It's hard to palpate that. Now, strength or power may be indicated by the vertical jump test. You get an idea of how much force you do. If you use a force plate, you can see how much rate of force development you're actually doing, pushing against the ground, and you can actually measure that. Generally desired to be 25 to 33% stronger than the hamstring group. However, there's a lot of research out there as well too that state if you're a sprinter, they want, because if your quads are too much stronger than the hamstrings, it could cause the hamstring distress, and you could cause injury or get a pulled muscle or a strained muscle. So if you look at a lot of sprinters now, since they're not pushing so much, they are pushing to propel themselves forward, but also too, as they stretch out, when their foot hits the ground, they're pulling through this way. And the hamstrings and glutes are really activated. So you want pretty much good strength, almost even strength on both sides of that knee and the hip. Now, strength and endurance is essential for maintaining patellofemoral stability. Now, this is often a problem. We talked about this because we get an imbalance of quad muscles, even the quad muscles, then also the strength imbalances between the anterior and posterior part of the leg, or quads versus hams. Quads are particularly prone to atrophy when injuries occur because you don't use them a lot, but so do the hamstrings. May be developed by resisted knee extension activities from a seated position. Now, this is only basically used in either rehabilitation, you do leg extensions or knee extensions, in rehabilitation in the very first stages, or in some kind of bodybuilding stuff. They really are, because they do put a lot of stress on the patellar tendon, patellar ligament, and especially if you're not lined up properly, it can cause tracking problems as well with the kneecap. So you need to really watch this. Most of the stuff you should be doing are like squats, lunges, single leg squats, those kind of things, because those are more ground-based movements. Now, functional weight-bearing activities such as step-ups, squats, particularly useful for strengthening, for increasing strength and endurance. But the endurance is more strength endurance. More endurance type of endurance strength is more from aerobic activities, because strength is important, but endurance is more important. So we really have to figure out what type of strength you need and what kind of movement pattern you need to increase the strength in whatever movements you're doing and how it's going to transfer to your activity. Now, the rectus femoris. That's rectus femoris. Remember, it crosses the hip joint and crosses the knee. That's flexion of the hip, extension of the knee, flexion, extension. It also does anterior pelvic rotation. So a lot of times if you have weak hip flexors, because it is a flexor of the hip, but if it's too tight, they'll pull the hips forward. They'll pull the pelvis, anteriorly tilt it. The vastus lateralis, it does nothing but extension of the knee. Vastus intermedius, it does nothing but extension of the knee. The vastus medialis, it does nothing but extension of the knee. Now the hamstrings, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris. Hamstring strains are very common. Running muscles function in acceleration. You're trying to come out and you're trying to pull through. Once again, that goes back to how much force you need, how fast you're going, and what the balance is between the quads and the ham. The antagonist to quadriceps muscles at the knee. We just talked about that. Named for a cord-like attachment at the knees. That's why they're called that, the hamstrings. They all originate on the ischial tuberosity of the pelvis. We looked at that picture. The semitendinosus inserts on the anterior medial tibia. So if we look here, anterior medial, that means anterior on the front part and medial side of the tibia. The semimembranosus inserts on the posterior side medially on the tibia. So the tendinosus in the front, The membranosus is in the back. The biceps femoris inserts on the lateral tibial condyle and the head of the fibula. So it attaches right in here. Lateral tibial condyle, and the head of the fibula on the outside. Now, flexion of the knee. The semitendinosus muscle does flexion of the knee, extension of the hip, but I also want you to remember this as well too with all these hamstring muscles. They're all going to do flexion of the knee, extension of the hip. Okay? But what happens if the feet are fixed? It will also do extension of the trunk as well. It does cause flexion of the knee, extension of the hip, but also too with the feet fixed, like if you're doing good mornings or you're doing stiff-legged deadlifts, what's that extension? That is trunk extension. That's not hip extension. It's trunk extension. It also internally rotates the hip. Internal rotation of the flexed knee as well. We talked about that. It does internal rotation. And if the hamstrings are too tight, it will cause posterior pelvic rotation. So what happens? You look at a squat. Somebody's squatting down to below parallel position. You know, they're doing a high bar squat. Once again, if you look at Olympic lifters and stuff, they do front squats or high bar squats. The knees are moving forward. When they go down to that below parallel position, if that pelvis is tucking in, which means the hamstrings don't have the right amount of flexibility, and when they contract, they're going to pull the pelvis under, posteriorly tilt that. That's why you have to look at that particular movement pattern through a full range of squats. Pelvis tucks in. If they have to shift forward, if it can't lengthen to keep that pelvis in a neutral position, hamstrings are too tight. The semimembranosus, flexion of the knee, extension of the hip, extension of the trunk, add that in. Internal rotation of the hip, internal rotation of the knee. Remember the internal rotation of the hip. Hamstrings will do that. They pull it in. Internal rotation of the knee, the flexed knee. And once again, posterior pelvic rotation. The bicep fem, flexion of the knee, extension of the hip, extension of the trunk, external rotation of the hip, because remember it's on the outside. It attaches on the outside of the knee. So it'll do external rotation of the hip. External rotation of a flexed knee. Remember the foot's going to go out to the side. Now once again, that's tight too. All the hamstrings, if they're too tight, they will cause pelvic rotation. And when they contract, they'll tuck it in. The popliteus, it's an assister muscle for flexion of the knee. And it also helps with the internal rotation of a flexed knee. So you can see, we talked about it on the outside of the condyle of the femur. And it attaches, it crosses the knee and causes internal rotation when it contracts. Now for knee extension, the agonists are the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, the vastus intermedius, and the vastus medialis. Knee flexion, the agonists are bicep fem, long and short heads. Now, an extension of the hip, an extension of the trunk, it's only the long head that's active. In flexion, it's both the long and the short head. Semitendinosus, semimembranosus. Internal knee rotation, the agonists are the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, popliteus. External rotation, the agonist of the biceps femoris. Now, we've gone through the knee, so you can see it's fairly complicated. And a lot of the movements that a lot of people are doing in the fitness industry, if you want full development, you have to be able to strengthen all the muscles around the knee to cause all the actions. Whether it's at the knee joint, but if the feet are fixed, it also will help movements of the trunk and the pelvis as well. So you really need to take a good look at how this is all put together. And the websites are too. They'll talk about different aspects of rehabilitation, injuries, all those kind of things. So it also gives you some more ideas about movement patterns, videos and all that people have looked at over the years. So you can see it's quite a bit of them. Take a good look at them, and we'll see you next time.